In this video, I'm going to review two very interesting Takumar lenses introduced in 1957, the 58mm f2 and the 58mm f2.4. These lenses, with different optical designs, are capable of quite beautiful images, and each lens has its own distinctive and sometimes dramatic character, as I'll be demonstrating through head-to-head comparisons. The lenses are also historically interesting. They are two of the very first standard lenses made in Japan for modern SLR cameras. They were only produced for 1 year, before being replaced by the popular and best-selling Takumar 55mm and later 50mm lenses. The Asahi Optical Company, who I'll call AOC from now on, sold these lenses under the Takumar brand name. AOC's approach to designing faster 50s was quite eclectic. They tried different designs, as you can see on this list, until they settled on an Ultron-type design for their 55mm lenses. Their oldest design, dating back to 1952, was for a 50mm f3.5 standard lens. It was based on a Tessa configuration and had an M37 mount. 2 years later, in 1954, AOC introduced a 58mm f2.4 lens, also on an M37 mount, with a Heliar type design. And according to their product description, the lens was specifically designed to cater for the growing popularity of colour photography. Then in 1957, the company introduced their first through the viewfinder SLR, the first modern-style SLR sold in Japan. It was called the Asahi Pentax, or AP, and it had an M42 screw mount. They adapted the M37 mount f2.4 lens to an M42 mount, and this is the lens I'm using in this video. In the same year, 1957, AOC introduced a new, faster lens, the 58 f2. The f2 wasn't based on a Heliar design, it used a Sonnar type design. It must have been quite a complex lens to make, as it included a cemented triplet in its 4 groups of 6 elements. This wasn't the end of AOC's experimentation in 1957. They also introduced a 55mm f2.2 lens, based on a Gaussian type design. Having tried 4 different designs, a Tessa, Heliar, Sonnar and Gaussian, AOC then decided that a 5th design, an Ultron type arrangement, would actually be the best one for their fast 50s, and it had 6 elements in 5 groups. It's the design they stuck with for the rest of their various M42 55mm lenses. There's been some speculation about why they dropped the designs. It could have been the cost of producing the lenses, or it could have been optical performance, or a mix of both. Personally, I'm a big fan of images that the Ultron-type designs produce. However, there's nothing quite like the fascinating and quirky results you get from both the Takumar 58mm lenses. I wouldn't say they're inferior, they're just different. But before turning to the optical performance, I should say a few words about the lens's physical designs and how these changed over time. Both the 58 f2 and f2.4 had preset aperture mechanisms, allowing the photographer to focus wide open and then use a clickless ring to stop down to a chosen f-stop. Today it's nice to have this clickless mechanism, especially for video work. In 1958, AOC replaced the preset mechanism with a cocking lever for their new auto Takumars, so instead of having to rotate the preset ring down to your chosen f-stop, the lever did the work for you. And then around 1960 they replaced the lever with a manual auto switch, followed by lenses that could support open aperture metering. So that's the history. Now let's turn to the lens's performance. And I'm talking about their performance on modern digital cameras, not on film cameras. I'm going to do this by comparing how the two lenses perform side by side, so you can see how the different designs perform, looking at the same scene. But firstly, I'd like to share my experiences of using each lens in turn. I acquired the f2 some time before the f2.4. I think it's a beautiful looking all-metal lens with its silvered parts, and it's rather cute size-wise. Actually, it's smaller than I expected from online photographs. The preset rings are a little fiddly to use, especially the one that sets the f-stop. There are better designs than this. Other than that, it's really well made. The minimum focusing distance is 0.6 meters. Nothing special today, but it's okay for a lens of its time. Stop down is by no means the sharpest vintage lens I own as a landscape lens, but it's pretty good edge to edge. And it's a plus to have those 10 aperture blades rather than the 6 blades of later 55mm Takumars. At the centre, close up and stop down a little, it's excellent. This is a good example of the sharpness and rendering. I processed the image to add some contrast. The lens is prone to quite exaggerated flares, but these can be turned into more artistic endeavours if you choose, and a good hood is strongly recommended to help with the contrasts. The colours are a little cool. They can have a bluish tint sometimes, but they're fine when the sun comes out. As well as colour images, I've very much enjoyed converting photos into black and white, where the contrasts are excellent. Wide open, the lens is easily sharp enough, and it produces lovely dreamy bokeh, helped no doubt by the relative lack of coatings, so the images can have a more washed out rendering in bright light. That's not necessarily a bad effect. It can give them an attractive watercolory look. Turning to the f2.4, this lens has been a delight to use from the very first time I took it out. It's the same size and shape as the f2. The f2.4 weighs around 155 grams. The f2 is a few grams heavier as it has more glass. The f2.4, like the f2, also has an MFD of 0.6 meters. Stopped down, the lens performs very well at the center, but my copy is noticeably softer than the f2 towards the edges. Here's a comparison stopped down to f8 between the f2.4 and the f2. In terms of colours, if the f2 has a bluish tint, I think the f2.4 has more of a purple and sometimes greenish tint. You can see the slight purple tint in the sky in this image, which is straight out of camera. Overall, the f2 appears to produce slightly more vibrant and cleaner colours, but you can always adjust the colours in post-processing. Unlike the f2, it's an excellent lens for converting images into black and white. The f2.4, like the f2, is prone to serious flare. Indeed, if you don't protect the lens with a proper hood when you shoot, you can get into big trouble, like some other things in life. Wide open, the f2.4 is surprisingly sharp. I know it's only f2.4, but still, for a lens of its age and lack of modern coatings, it really is sharp if you nail the focus. I wasn't expecting it to be as sharp as this. As well as center sharpness wide open, there's something different and rather eye-catching about the lens's out-of-focus rendering, something I'll attempt to analyze next in the side-by-side comparisons. So here are some side-by-side comparisons of the f2 Sonnar design lens with the f2.4 Heliar lens. I'll scroll through pairs of images from the lenses, and while I'm doing this, I'll say a few words about the cameras I used. I put one lens on a Sony a7 IV full-frame camera and the other on a Pentax K1 full-frame camera. I swap the lenses around sometimes. Both cameras use a Sony sensor, and in terms of output, I don't think there's a meaningful difference in results from the camera themselves as opposed to the lenses, especially after a little subtle processing. I have done a little processing, most notably to the exposures, as the two cameras clearly have different metering algorithms. Sony's EVF doesn't give nearly as nice and good a view as the DSLR's mirrored viewfinder, but balanced against this, I do like the ability to zoom in on the EVF to nail the focus, and I like all the information and reviews you get with the EVF. Anyway, now you've seen some of the comparisons, you'll probably have your own views about the differences and similarities in how the lenses perform wide open. And here are my views, quite subjective and open to debate of course, because I'm going to be talking mainly about how the lenses render out-of-focus blur. My overriding conclusion is that the f2.4, with its Heliar design, produces more eccentric, eye-catching bokeh, with more distinctive cat's eyes effects. And sometimes the f2.4 can become a little wild, while the f2 is smoother overall. If you like imperfect and colourful bokeh from a lens, then the f2.4 is probably the more interesting lens. But you might think the opposite, of course. Please let us know in the comments below. Here are some more individual, wide-open images from the f2.4. First of all, it's clearly a bubble bokeh monster, capable of producing excellent soap bubbles with lines around the edges of highlights. Secondly, it produces the most extraordinary details in the out-of-focus areas in certain conditions, if you zoom right in. It's easier to show you the effects, rather than trying to explain them. The lens certainly produces cool-looking patterns inside those bubbles. The Sonnar-designed f2, in contrast, is more refined. It's smoother. If you look at this pair of images, there are various areas I can highlight, where it's pretty obvious the f2's rendering is smoother. This is not the only Sonnar-designed vintage lens I use that produces lovely smooth bokeh. The Carl Zeiss Jena Sonnar 135 f3.5, for example, has broadly similar characteristics. And the still in production Sony Zeiss Sonnar 55 f1.8 can also deliver lovely smooth bokeh. Back to a detailed look at the Takuma's f2 rendering wide open. The lens doesn't produce such clearly defined soap bubbles as the f2.4, i.e. they don't always have such clear lines around the highlights, although they are there sometimes. The bubbles can have some more texture on the inside, as you can see here. I've seen this effect on other images from the lens. It's not too distracting. In fact, it can make the bubbles look rather three-dimensional. One significant effect of the f2 lens is that it can produce swirly bubbles in the right conditions. I process these images to accentuate the swirls. What the f2 lacks in terms of the drama of the f2.4, I think it more than makes up with its lovely rendering and its occasional swirls. But not to be outdone, in the right conditions and the right light, the f2.4 can also swirl. And it's important to reiterate that both these lenses sharpen up very nicely if you stop down a little. Here are two examples from the f2, transitioning from f2 to f4, and another one stopped all the way down. So that's my take on these two wonderful lenses. I'd sum it all up by saying the 58 f2 can produce lovely images, while the more eccentric f2.4 is capable of real magic. It's been a lot of fun using the two lenses side by side, and I hope you've enjoyed seeing the photos. I suppose the big question is, do I prefer these 58mm lenses over and above the other Takuma Fast 50s, the 55s and the 50s? Well, I do like the extra focal length, and if you're mostly into portraits in particular, 58mm is a nice length to have. And in terms of rendering, the 58 certainly delivers some eye-catching results, most notably the f2.4. It's got a lot of character. The f2 also has a lot of character and performs very well, but I think it's matched by some of the next generation Auto Takuma 55s, first made in 1958, lenses that produce beautiful results in their own right. If you're looking for a similar style of image to the 58s, I'd go for one of those Auto Takumas, rather than the later 55s or the 50s. I wouldn't say the Takuma 58s are must-have lenses for everyone. There are other, more widely available vintage 58mm lenses out there that will also produce interesting and quirky results. The Minolta Rocca 58 f1.4 is one example. It's a much cheaper lens I've recently reviewed on YouTube. It can produce crazy bokeh wide open, and it's sharper stop down than the Takumas. However, speaking as a collector, the Takuma 58s are a must-have. I feel they're worth the price they've been selling for online, when you find one for sale, that is. They're more in the hidden gem category, and haven't been hugely expensive lenses to buy to date, and I don't think you'll regret buying one. If you're interested, you can see more of my photos with the Takuma 58, 55 and 50 lenses on Flickr, arranged into albums. And please add your comments below. I'm always very keen to read your views on my videos and the lenses. If you're interested and haven't already done so, you could also take a look at my separate YouTube videos on the Takuma 55mm lenses and the Takuma 50mm lenses.